The room carried the quiet tension of formality, the kind that makes even the smallest sound feel amplified. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her pen resting gently between her fingers as Alan Dershowitz concluded his statement. His words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, smooth and deliberate, as if they had been rehearsed in the mirror of decades spent defending powerful men. He spoke of constitutional balance, of due process, and of his unwavering belief that every person, no matter how controversial, deserved a strong defense. To those unfamiliar with his long career, his tone might have sounded noble, but to Crockett, it was a carefully polished veneer masking something deeper. Asterisk, she had listened without interruption, her eyes sharp, catching the subtle inconsistencies in his phrasing. Dershowitz had a habit of turning morality into theory, abstracting justice into something theoretical rather than lived. When he finished, he leaned back slightly, hands folded, as though expecting admiration or agreement. But Crockett's stillness didn't grant him that comfort. She adjusted her microphone, leaned forward, and met his gaze. Asterisk, Professor Dershowitz, she began, her voice calm and even. You've often said that your work is about defending principles, not people. Yet your clients and causes always seem to share one thing in common. They hold power. So, I want to ask you this. If no one is above the law, why do your defenses always protect those who already stand above it? Asterisk, the words weren't aggressive. There was no rise in tone or theatrical delivery, but the weight of the question settled over the hearing like a heavy curtain. Dershowitz blinked, momentarily frozen, his confident posture faltering for just a second. It was a rare sight, the veteran legal scholar, faced with a question that didn't attack his intellect, but his moral consistency. Asterisk, he tried to respond with the same composure he had always mastered. Congresswoman, my defenses are about legal precedent, he said, his tone clipped and measured. I take on cases that test the boundaries of law, not because of who the client is, but because of what the case represents. Asterisk, Crockett didn't interrupt. She simply tilted her head slightly, eyes never leaving him. The silence after his answer lingered too long, making his justification sound thinner by the second. So, she continued softly, when those boundaries are tested by ordinary people, by communities without influence, where are you then? Asterisk, that question hit differently. There was no immediate counter. Dershowitz's hand shifted, fingers tightening on his stack of notes. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The camera zoomed in, capturing the subtle discomfort that words couldn't hide. For someone whose career thrived on precision and persuasion, this was unfamiliar terrain. Asterisk, Crockett didn't smile, didn't smirk. Her tone stayed grounded, almost gentle, but her control of the space was undeniable. She wasn't performing for sound bites. She was dismantling a logic that had long gone unchallenged. What made her question powerful wasn't its complexity, but its simplicity. It called out the moral blind spot that Dershowitz had turned into professional neutrality. Asterisk around them. The other members shifted slightly. Even the faint tapping of a pen stopped. Crockett spoke again, slower this time, giving her words space to breathe. The law, she said, is supposed to protect the powerless from the powerful. But when people like you use it to shield those already protected, it stops being justice. It becomes privilege. Asterisk, Dershowitz looked down briefly, scanning his notes as though an answer might be hiding somewhere in the text. His response, when it came, was defensive, a web of academic phrasing about constitutional obligations and legal ethics. But the rhythm had changed. His authority no longer filled the room. It was now measured against the quiet moral clarity of the Congresswoman across from him. Asterisk. The moment wasn't loud or chaotic. It was controlled, surgical. Crockett had exposed what years of interviews and debates hadn't, that Dershowitz's claim of impartiality was selective. His intellectual armor couldn't protect him from a question rooted in conscience. And as he spoke, his words sounded less like conviction and more like justification. The kind of reasoning that tries to convince others because it no longer convinces itself. Asterisk for Crockett. This wasn't about scoring points. It was about drawing a line between defending the law and distorting it. She had spent her career watching how people like him turned technicalities into tools of inequality. Now, face to face, she made him confront the imbalance he'd long ignored. Her calm precision didn't humiliate him. It revealed him. Asterisk, by the time her time was up, the hearing room had shifted. The murmurs that followed weren't about politics, but about the power of a simple question, one that asked not for intellect, but for integrity. And as Dershowitz gathered his papers, he did so with the uneasy awareness that for all his expertise, he had finally encountered a question that stripped away the comfort of legal language and left him facing something far harder to answer: the truth of his own pattern. When the silence stretched between Jasmine Crockett and Alan Dershowitz, it wasn't just an awkward pause, it was a collision between intellect and accountability. For decades, Dershowitz had built his reputation as one of America's most brilliant legal minds. He had argued before the Supreme Court, taught generations of lawyers, and defended figures whose names stirred national headlines. His confidence had always been his armor, his intellect, his weapon. But in that hearing room, when Crockett's question landed, the armor cracked. and for the first time, the weapon failed him. Asterisk. He sat there, momentarily suspended in uncertainty, searching for words that had always come easily. The pause wasn't long by the clock, but it felt endless to those watching. The cameras didn't miss a thing. The slight tightening of his jaw, the shuffle of his notes, the faint clearing of his throat. It was the visible discomfort of a man who suddenly realized that logic and eloquence could not save him from the weight of moral truth. Asterisk. Dershowitz began to speak again, falling back on what he knew best, the language of law. Congresswoman, he said, voice steady but thinner than before, I have always defended the principle of due process. My clients may be powerful, but that doesn't make them unworthy of constitutional protection. It was the same reasoning he had used countless times in interviews and lectures, but the words felt recycled, lacking the conviction they once carried. Crockett didn't interrupt. She simply watched him, letting the silence after his response expose its hollowness. Asterisk. What unfolded wasn't a debate. It was a quiet unraveling. Dershowitz's authority, once unshakable, began to waver under the weight of a question that reached beyond law books. For the first time, his intellectual reflexes betrayed him. His arguments, though technically sound, couldn't answer the moral imbalance at their core. He had spent a lifetime defending principles, but those principles had become selective, applied generously to the powerful and sparingly to the powerless. Crockett had forced him to confront that contradiction, and the effort to explain it drained the certainty from his voice. Asterisk. There was something almost humanizing about the moment. Dershowitz wasn't angry or indignant. He looked reflective, perhaps even shaken. It was as if Crockett's question had pulled him out of the courtroom and placed him in front of a mirror. His pauses grew longer. His tone softened, as though he was no longer addressing her, but reasoning with himself. He spoke about the importance of precedent, the sanctity of defense, the dangers of mob justice, ideas that once inspired applause in academic halls. But now, in that congressional chamber, they sounded detached, stripped of the urgency they once carried. Asterisk. Crockett didn't need to respond immediately. Her silence became part of the questioning. Each second of stillness made his words echo louder in their emptiness. She had achieved something rare. She made a man, who built a career on having every answer, realize there were questions intellect alone couldn't solve. It wasn't an attack. It was exposure. Asterisk. Around the room, aides shifted uncomfortably, and even some of the committee members exchanged looks that carried a quiet recognition. This was not the confident Alan Dershowitz they had seen on television. This was a man grappling, in real time, with the realization that brilliance without balance can lead to blindness. Asterisk. When he finally stopped speaking, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Crockett leaned slightly forward and said, almost softly, Professor, no one here denies your contribution to law, but defending fairness only for the favored, doesn't that make the law itself unequal? Asterisk. It wasn't a rebuke. It was an observation, one that pierced through layers of pride and rhetoric. Dershowitz's lips tightened as he looked down again. He didn't answer right away. He knew that any response would sound defensive, and defensiveness would only confirm what her words implied. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, the acknowledgement that intellect, when detached from empathy, can become its own kind of blindness. Asterisk. His silence said more than any argument could. For someone who had spent decades commanding rooms, shaping narratives, and dissecting the logic of others, he now sat quietly, as though even he understood the futility of speaking further. The moment wasn't loud, but it was seismic, not because Crockett defeated him, but because she disarmed him with simplicity. Asterisk. He had faced prosecutors, presidents, and pundits, but never someone who turned his own moral framework inward. Crockett didn't use the language of outrage or accusation. She used truth, unembellished, precise, and rooted in the lived reality of people the law often overlooks. Dershowitz, surrounded by his books and doctrines, suddenly looked small in the face of that simplicity. Asterisk. As the session moved forward, his later remarks were more restrained, less certain. The old spark of defiance that usually colored his tone was gone. It wasn't humiliation. It was recognition, the kind that comes when a man sees the cracks in his own logic. In that brief exchange, Crockett had done what years of criticism couldn't. She made him face the quiet limits of his intellect. The power of her question wasn't that it silenced him. It was that it made him listen, perhaps for the first time, not to others, but to the uneasy echo of his own justifications. The atmosphere in the hearing room had changed completely. What began as another routine exchange between a seasoned legal scholar and a congressional representative had turned into something far more revealing. Alan Dershowitz, who was used to commanding attention with his eloquence and reputation, now sat in a different kind of spotlight, one that didn't celebrate him but scrutinized him. The spectators, staffers, and even the committee members seemed to sense it. Jasmine Crockett's question had pierced through the usual political noise and drawn everyone into a quiet realization. Asterisk. When Crockett first asked why his legal defenses always seemed to protect those already in power, the initial reaction in the room was subtle. A few raised eyebrows, a few sideways glances. But as the silence stretched, people began to notice something that rarely happened. Dershowitz didn't have an immediate answer. The pause spoke louder than any argument. You could feel the shift, the moment when the audience collectively understood that this wasn't just about a legal debate. It was about something deeper: integrity, balance, and truth. Asterisk, in hearings like this, the rhythm is predictable. The witnesses speak, the representatives counter, and everyone eventually retreats into their prepared talking points. But this time, the rhythm broke. Dershowitz's voice, once the most commanding in the room, faltered just enough to reveal uncertainty. His words, usually layered with conviction, now carried hesitation. Those observing leaned forward slightly, curious to see if the professor, who had out-ocked prosecutors and pundits alike, could find footing again. Asterisk Crockett, meanwhile, didn't rush him. She didn't fill the silence or press further. She simply let the weight of her question do its work. It was a quiet strategy, but it was effective. Every second that passed deepened the collective understanding of what had just happened. The room wasn't reacting to confrontation, it was reacting to exposure. Asterisk A. Staffers sitting behind one of the committee members scribbled a note and passed it forward. A journalist in the back began typing rapidly, sensing a headline forming. Even the cameras seemed to focus more intently, as though capturing not just a scene but a shift in tone. The people in that room weren't just watching a disagreement, they were witnessing the rare moment when someone with immense intellectual authority was forced into introspection. Asterisk Dershowitz tried to recover, his voice steady but measured. He spoke about legal ethics, about the duty of an attorney to provide defense regardless of public opinion. His explanation was sound, but something about it no longer resonated. The audience wasn't questioning his legal right to defend anyone, they were questioning his pattern, his consistency, his moral compass. Crockett's earlier question had reframed the conversation entirely. She hadn't accused him of wrongdoing, she had simply made people ask whether his principles had boundaries. Asterisk the room had become still, almost reverent in its silence. You could see the expressions of those behind the panel, some intrigued, some thoughtful, a few uncomfortable. They all recognized that what was unfolding went beyond partisanship. This was about the fragile line between using the law as a shield and using it as a sword. Crockett had drawn that line clearly, and Dershowitz now stood on the wrong side of it. Asterisk when she spoke again, it wasn't loud or performative. The law doesn't just exist for the powerful. Professor, she said softly, her tone level. It's meant for everyone, especially those without the means to hire people like you. Asterisk the words hit with quiet precision. A few heads nodded subtly around the room. It wasn't about agreement or politics, it was about recognition. Everyone in that moment could see the truth she was pointing to. Dershowitz sat still, listening, his expression unreadable. The flicker of defensiveness from earlier had faded. What replaced it was something closer to contemplation. Asterisk observers whispered quietly to one another as the hearing continued. The cameras captured every movement, Crockett's composed demeanor, Dershowitz's thoughtful silence, the shifting energy in the room. It wasn't chaos or argument that made the moment memorable. It was the calm clarity of it. Crockett had managed to turn a hearing into a mirror, forcing everyone, including Dershowitz, to look at how easily intellect can become a barrier to humility. Asterisk, when Dershowitz finally spoke again, he thanked her for her question. It was brief and somewhat restrained, but it carried a trace of sincerity. He didn't attempt to reassert dominance or turn the tables. For once, he didn't debate, he acknowledged. And though the acknowledgement was subtle, it was significant. It showed that even the sharpest legal minds could be made to pause, to reflect, to confront what intellect alone could not justify. Asterisk, by the time the exchange ended, the tone of the entire hearing had shifted. The questions that followed from other members seemed gentler, more introspective. No one wanted to follow what had just taken place. The story wasn't about Crockett overpowering him. It was about her restoring something to the conversation that law often loses: moral gravity. Those watching, whether in person or through the camera lens, could feel that something honest had just occurred. In a room built on rhetoric, long after the hearing ended, clips of the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Alan Dershowitz began circulating online. It wasn't the typical kind of viral moment filled with shouting or outrage. Instead, it was the quiet tension, the stillness of Dershowitz's pause, and the calm force of Crockett's question that drew people in. Viewers replayed the short video not for drama, but to witness the rare instant when a man so certain of his intellect seemed to lose the ability to defend himself. The impact rippled outward, sparking discussions in newsrooms, classrooms, and social media threads across the country. Asterisk, what made the exchange powerful wasn't what was said afterward, but what couldn't be said in that moment. Dershowitz, known for his sharp reasoning and fearless defenses of controversial figures, had met a question that couldn't be answered with legal jargon. It wasn't about the Constitution, precedent, or due process. It was about moral alignment. Crockett's words cut past theory and reached something deeper: the ethics behind the choice of who receives that defense. She hadn't accused him of corruption or bad faith. She had simply asked why his principles always seemed to protect power rather than challenge it. Asterisk, in the days that followed, Commentators tried to frame the moment. Some defended Dershowitz, calling him a guardian of civil liberties who had always stood for legal equality, regardless of the client. Others sided with Crockett, arguing that his track record told a different story, one where the scales of justice tipped toward those who already had wealth and influence. The conversation evolved from a single exchange into a broader question about what justice really means in a system built on hierarchy. Asterisk for Dershowitz. The fallout was uncomfortable but telling. He appeared on a few programs afterward, attempting to clarify his stance. He insisted that his defenses were not about the powerful but about protecting the law itself from political manipulation. Yet even as he spoke, the clips from the hearing played in split screen, his brief silence replayed in slow motion. The contrast was striking. No amount of explanation could erase the image of him sitting speechless before a question he couldn't reason away. Asterisk Crockett, on the other hand, didn't gloat or make rounds on talk shows. She released no statement, offered no victory lap. Her restraint only amplified the power of the moment. Her question had already done what words afterward couldn't. It reminded people that intellect without moral consistency is hollow. By saying less, she made her point resonate longer. Asterisk across online spaces. People began sharing the clip with captions like the question that shut down Dershowitz: accountability isn't aggression. Law students analyzed the exchange in discussions about ethics. Political commentators dissected the tone of her delivery, noting how it combined sharpness with restraint. Even among legal professionals, the debate became personal. Some admired Dershowitz's lifelong commitment to defending constitutional principles. Others saw in him a man who had grown blind to the privilege embedded in his own practice. Asterisk. What emerged was something Crockett likely hadn't planned, but achieved effortlessly. A national conversation about selective justice. Her confrontation with Dershowitz revealed how the law, when separated from empathy, can become a tool for maintaining inequality. It wasn't a moment of personal triumph. It was a reflection of something much larger. People began to ask the same question she had posed to him, but now of institutions, systems, and themselves. Who does justice truly serve? Asterisk. In academic circles, professors discussed how the incident demonstrated the tension between intellectual defense and moral accountability. Dershowitz's response, or lack of it, became a case study in how intellect alone cannot bridge the gap between legality and fairness. For decades, he had represented some of the most powerful figures in America, justifying his choices as acts of legal principle. But Crockett's question reframed those acts as moral decisions, and once they could not be explained away by doctrine. Asterisk. The shift in perception didn't destroy Dershowitz's reputation, but it dented it in a way that words couldn't repair. He continued to lecture, to write, and to defend his beliefs. But that hearing lingered like an unspoken asterisk. Whenever his name appeared in headlines afterward, so did the memory of that exchange. The Congresswoman's steady gaze. The question that hung unanswered. The moment when intellect met conscience and stumbled. Asterisk for Crockett, the aftermath was subtle yet profound. She didn't need to claim victory. The moment itself had already spoken for her. Her composure and clarity became emblematic of a different kind of power, one rooted not in authority, but in truth. She hadn't destroyed Dershowitz with force. She had disarmed him with reason, and that distinction mattered. Her single question didn't just challenge him, it exposed a pattern. Within the culture of power that too often hides behind the shield of legality. Asterisk. Months later, as discussions about justice and privilege continued to surface in politics and media, that hearing remained a reference point. It was revisited not as a viral confrontation, but as an example of how accountability can be delivered without anger, how truth can be spoken without spectacle. And though Dershowitz continued to defend his record, he could never quite erase that one moment when Jasmine Crockett, with nothing more than a calm question, had shifted the conversation from intellect to integrity and left him, for the first time, without an answer. When the cameras turned off and the noise of the hearing faded, what remained was not the echo of confrontation but the quiet resonance of truth. Jasmine Crockett had not raised her voice, nor had she sought applause. She had done something far rarer. She asked a question that refused to fade. Alan Dershowitz, for all his brilliance and experience, had found himself facing something he could not cross-examine or out-argue: the moral clarity of a simple question. Asterisk. In the weeks that followed, the exchange continued to surface across networks and platforms, but its endurance had little to do with spectacle. People were drawn to it because it exposed a larger truth about power, privilege, and principle. Dershowitz's moment of hesitation became symbolic of the broader struggle between intellect and integrity, between defending what is legal and upholding what is right. His silence wasn't just personal, it represented a pause in the endless rationalizations that often protect those at the top. Crockett's.com, persistence forced a collective reckoning, one that stretched beyond politics and into the conscience of those watching. Asterisk. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't victory or defeat. It was the balance between conviction and control. Crockett never sought to humiliate him. Instead, she allowed his own logic to meet its limit. Her poise reminded everyone that accountability doesn't need volume, it needs precision. She didn't attack his intellect. She questioned how he used it. In doing so, she reminded the public that intelligence, no matter how vast, loses its value when detached from empathy. For Dershowitz, that hearing will remain an indelible part of his legacy, not because it ended his career, but because it revealed the human side of a man long considered untouchable in debate. His stumble was not born of ignorance, but of overconfidence, a belief that legal mastery could always protect him from ethical scrutiny. Crockett showed that it couldn't. She revealed that even the most respected minds must occasionally answer to the simplicity of moral truth. The story of that exchange endures because it wasn't about politics, it was about perspective. It reminded the nation that the real test of intellect is not how well one defends power, but how courageously one confronts it. Crockett's question became a mirror, not only for Dershowitz but for everyone accustomed to mistaking cleverness for virtue. In the end, what lingered wasn't the tension of the hearing, but the lesson it left behind. That silence, when it follows a question of integrity, can be more revealing than any argument. Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy Alan Dershowitz. She held him accountable in the purest way possible, by making him, all who watched, remember that the law without conscience is just words, and justice without courage is just a concept. And sometimes, it only takes one honest question.